Hi everyone, this is lecture 3.3, Social Change and Class. So the theme of this lecture is that we often assume that the way class status operates does not change from one generation to the next. However, it does, and it is. The way class is oriented here in the United States today has changed really dramatically between the current generation of young people and the previous generation, and it did shift between the previous generation and the generation before that. So basically, what I'm talking about is people who are commonly labeled as millennials are they live in a different social world and they are coming of age in a different social world than those who are commonly labeled baby boomers. And I want to illustrate that a little bit. Another thing I want to illustrate in this lecture is that the micro causes the macro, and we'll talk about a little bit about that. The macro causes the micro, so we'll talk about the 2008 economic downturn, and then how those two things can interact with each other to create a shift in a social phenomena. So this lecture is structured a little bit differently than other lectures. It might be a little bit shorter time-wise, which I'm sure some of you aren't complaining. So let's just see how this goes. So let's first talk about how micro-level events can cause macro-level social change in the name of CEO income. So starting in the 1970s, pay for corporate CEOs became highly competitive because there was a perception that the right CEO was seen as like being the thing to make a corporation succeed. You will see that in the 60s and 70s. So let me explain this chart a little bit more. First, along the x-axis, you see years, and along the y-axis, you see the multiplier, the times greater the CEO's pay is from the average worker, not the poorest worker, not the least paid worker, not the most brand new worker, but the most average worker. So we see in 1965 that CEO pay was somewhere around 10 times more than the average worker, and that general trend continued until about the late 70s. Then it started to rise, and we see it as being maybe 50 times greater by 1985, and then about 75 times greater by, let's call it, 1993. And then we see this massive spike in the late 90s and early 2000s, and it peaked at around, that looks like either 99 or 2000 as the highest. And just looking at this right here, it looked like it was about 375 times greater. And that was seen, that's huge, right? It's huge. Now, in 2016, given this isn't 2016 anymore, but it's about leveled off. You see it's been more or less level since about what we can call 2012 or so. It's been equaled off at about what the chart says, 270 times more the average worker, right? So the CEO is making 270 times more the average worker. That is less than it was in 2000, but it's big. It's a big difference. That means that the CEO can work like a month, less than a month, probably more like 2 weeks, and make as much money as the average worker would make in a year. And that is a micro level phenomena, right? So within the company, the people that choose and decide how much the CEO is paid, that's a small number of people, and they're paying that one person, that one CEO. So that is a micro level phenomena, but it has ramifications toward and it indicates toward trends on the macro level. Now let's talk, and this is an indicator of social polarization in the United States, but let's talk about how the macro then can impact the micro, the 2008 economic downturn. So shifting that, you may notice, you may have noticed, it might be why you're in college, it might be why you've come back to college if you came back. Why is it so hard to get a job? That might be a question you've asked yourself. Well, the common answer is the economy is in bad shape. And this is a irritating thing that I do in conversations, is that I will ask questions until we get to the crux of the matter. Okay, so, the economy is in bad shape. Why is the economy in bad shape? And then the common answer is we are recovering, but while corporations are doing dramatically better, the economy never really recovered after the 2008 housing collapse. There shouldn't be a question mark there. That's a reality. That was my typo. Okay, then you might ask yourself, well, what happened in 2008? Some of you might have been little kids in 2008. Others of you, it's been a decade. So you might not remember as crisply as what happened in 2008. And honestly, a lot of us, we were living our busy lives. We weren't really keeping track of all this stuff in 2008 when it went down. And when it did go down, it was incredibly confusing. So let's talk about how this macro level event that a lot of us don't really understand impacted a whole lot of people. So what happened in 2008? Well, in the 1990s and early 2000s, it was a time of unprecedented economic growth. Some economists were saying, and this is the height of hubris, right? If you want your GRE vocab word for the day, it's hubris. Go look it up. It was the height of hubris. It was the height of arrogance, because economists literally were believing that we would never have another economic recession during this time. They thought that possibly we would see forever growth, which doesn't make sense on so many levels. During the same time, housing lenders were giving massive loans to people who probably should not have been getting loans, right? And this was a very common thing. You could not turn on a TV, you could not listen to the radio without people saying, hey, want a house? You can have a house. Do you have bad credit or no credit? No problem. So they were giving home loans to anyone, absolutely anyone. And we can discuss, like, well, who deserves a home? Doesn't everyone deserve a home? And there are some valid arguments there, but there are also valid arguments to, well, if someone continually racks up credit card debt, then maybe they're not the person to go into even greater debt, right? There is a certain logic there, and that's the logic of modern capitalism, right? So that's the system we're in, for what it is. And the system we're in started to say, you know what, let's not follow our own rules, right? We're capitalists, but let's just let anyone have a loan that wants it. So they gave anyone a loan. And, one way to put it is, that guy you went to high school with that should not be responsible for anything? They were giving that guy a loan. And they were giving him everyone, on massive scales, loans like that. So that was one piece, the irresponsible loan piece. Big piece. But meanwhile, politicians were pushing for greater deregulation of the banking system. And these deregulations allowed for investment in these things called hedge fund derivatives. And honestly, it doesn't matter too much for your greater understanding what the heck they are, because they're called highly complex instruments. They're really complicated. If you really want to understand what those are, hedge fund derivatives, check out thisamericanlife.org / all those extra numbers there. The series was called The Giant Pool of Money. It was, I think, like a 5-part series on NPR, and it really sussed out like what exactly this thing was. But what you need to know is that in 2008, many hedge funds were based on property values, right? So we have this massive portion of the economy that is being heavily invested in based on how much property is worth. That's part one. And then part two, we had thousands, probably more like thousands, tens of thousands of people that were in these really shaky mortgages, right? And if you default on your home, if you can't pay your mortgage anymore, your property goes down, right? Your property value goes down. So we have these thousands of mortgages who were at high risk for property values going down. And we also have millions and maybe billions of dollars being invested in these kinds of properties, right? And it was really a formula for disaster. So by 2008, and this is kind of the linchpin, right? By 2008, many of the people who were given loans to buy houses were defaulting on their loans, which again, by the logic of capitalism, shouldn't be surprising, but it was surprising. And part of this was because they should never really have been given loans in the first place. Maybe the process of who gets a loan and who doesn't get a loan is completely unfair. And let's say maybe it's unfair for 75% of the people, that maybe they really should be given a loan, and maybe they shouldn't be too as hard on people, right? Well, so it's 75% unfair. Even if it was only 25% fair, right, then those 25% of people were defaulting on their loans. It was very, very bad, to put it simply. So once a critical mass of people, once enough people defaulted on those loans, the housing market lost massive amounts of value. And then once the housing market lost those massive amounts of value, it impacted other parts of the economy. And it started to tank on those credit default swaps and those hedge fund derivatives, right? Those highly complex instruments in the economy that so much was based on, that so much money was invested in, which caused a basically a collapse of the economy. To take it back to Social 101, one piece, the economy is a social institution, and all social institutions are interconnected, and also connections. There also have connections from within, right? So if the economy tanks, then it impacts other parts, other social institutions, right? So the economy, economics is one part of our society, and if economics falls apart, then families suffer, because the economy is businesses, right? People have their jobs in businesses, and then that causes families to not be able to go on vacation and not be able to eat enough. And then that causes damage to the government, because the government has to give out greater assistance to those families that can't eat enough, right, and might be getting kicked out of their house. So it strains social services. And then that impacts churches or any religious institutions that want to help people from being poor and destitute, right? So that strains them too, and it creates a domino effect, right? So in short, let me check the next slide. Sorry. In very short, this irresponsible setup of giving loans that shouldn't have been given, and setting up these complex derivatives, and deregulating the economy, right, which don't sound like something that should impact your ability to feed your kids, right? It sounds far, far away, but it did, and it does, and it created a complex domino effect that greatly weakened our society and put us in the spot where we are now, where people that are graduating from college can't just find a job the way they did in the late 90s, right? So why are your parents or older people or people with already that have jobs for 15 years, why are they saying, well, these young people, they're just so lazy. Why don't they move out of their parents' house? Ugh. Well, that's because the economy's garbage. And the economy's garbage because people who were investing in the early 2000s were incredibly arrogant and were very short-sighted. So, once enough sectors of the economy lost enough money, companies started going out of business, people started losing jobs, right? So, macro change, micro change. Those companies that survived stopped hiring, therefore no new jobs, and therefore, like I just said, no jobs for college students after college. New graduates have to go back to live with their parents, and it is not their/your fault. The way society is, the reason you can't find a job, the reason you have to do a job search for 6 months online, even if you're doing it for hours a day, that is a symptom of the weakened economic state we're in, despite the fact that we supposedly have been in an economic recovery since about 2012. Well, I haven't seen that. I don't know if you've seen it. I feel like everyone's still pretty poor. So, the outcome of these two phenomena, the outcome of CEOs and other really rich people getting so much more money, combined with this downturn in the economy where, while business may be getting better, the average worker is making less, and also there are those of us who aren't the average worker, who are either underemployed or unemployed, right? Making so much less. This has created an influx in what's called class consciousness, which we discussed in a previous lecture. Now, this is a direct quote from Dr. Craig Jenkins, he's a professor at Ohio State and actually worked with a little bit in college. And he loved to say, he probably still loves to say, the single greatest predictor of a social movement, that a social movement will happen, is a large population of unemployed young people, right? That is the greatest indicator that a social movement or social revolution will happen. And he didn't just make that up. He observed this in statistical analysis and some really complex, amazing computer programs. Just really interesting stuff. Well, in the early 2000s, and it doesn't seem like society's changed dramatically. Maybe it does, I don't know. I'm a social change person, so I always see social change. But maybe to you it might seem like society hasn't changed dramatically since the early 2000s. But here's one way it did. In the early 2000s, many Americans not only thought that everyone had a completely equal chance in America, they denied that class even existed. They just denied it. They said everyone in America is middle class no matter what. They stuck their fingers in their ears and completely disregarded everything we've been talking about in our lectures for the last couple of lectures, right? And this all changed with Occupy Wall Street. You might be familiar with Occupy Wall Street. It was a couple years ago. It started in September 2011. So, and I saw the rumblings of this over the summer of September 2011. Over the summer of 2011. There were people saying on Facebook in social movement communities, yeah, we're going to have this big thing. It's going to be a big deal. You need to get to New York in September. And I was looking at this thing, like, nothing's going to happen. And then it did, right? So what happened was thousands of people in New York City and tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people worldwide. But let's talk about New York for a second. Occupied a public park in New York City. It was a relatively small stretch of land, but it was downtown on Wall Street in New York City. Thus the name Occupy Wall Street. And this was an act of civil disobedience. It was an anti-capitalist act of civil disobedience. They literally were occupying a park. They were just sitting there saying, we're not going to leave until we see some social change happen here. Let me look at the next slide, sorry. This movement was avowedly anti-capitalist. So they said, you know what? Wall Street, and they used Wall Street as a synonym for capitalism, you're broken. And everything's broken and everything sucks. Nobody has jobs. I don't know if you can hear that. I think my daughter is playing with her, oh goodness. She's playing with her little keyboard set. Anyway, I hope it's not too distracting. But so Occupy Wall Street, that's actually really funny. Occupy Wall Street was anti-capitalist. It was anti-authoritarian, right? So there were no actual leaders of Occupy Wall Street, which made it its own thing. It made it hard to deal with. It made it really difficult to classify as a social movement. But the major piece of Occupy Wall Street, because it was a short-lived social movement, let's emphasize that too, right? Occupy Wall Street only really lasted for, if we give it a generous estimate, it lasted for 6 months. But in some places it was only like a week, right? But its major contribution to society was that this saying, we are the 99%, meaning that a very small group of people controls the majority of wealth in society. And that is the thing, I talked about in previous lectures in this class bit. That is the thing that that is the thing that drives, our understanding of class consciousness in the United States, that the super, super rich own most of the stuff. And it's obvious as soon as you say it, but unless you say it, it doesn't make any sense. And this idea, this movement spread worldwide. It was here in Columbus. It was in Atlanta. It was in Detroit. It was in San Diego. It was in London. It was in Madrid. It was in Paris. I'm not absolutely sure. I'm pretty sure it was in Albuquerque. It was in Moscow. It was all over the world. It was in Beijing, right? Moscow and Beijing. So Russia and China, two highly oppressive, authoritarian governments, had the presence of this highly anti-authoritarian social movement. And while it was a short-lived social movement, it changed the way we view social class and the way we view capitalist authority in a way that I'm not entirely sure it's possible to understand if you weren't an adult at that time, which is a total cop-out, right? So if I suppose if you weren't an adult in 2011, just take my word for it or do a little bit more reading. That's really super lame of me to say, I suppose. But anyway, like I said, most Occupy operations fizzled out after a few weeks. The majority lasted less than a year. Mainly because, and this is my assessment as a social movement, they didn't have any central authority, right? They didn't have any centralized leaders, and it was an amazingly beautiful idea that they could have a social movement without centralized leaders. And it was like, I took part in the one in Columbus, Ohio. It was really a neat, fun, great idea that there wouldn't be leaders, but unfortunately without leaders there was no one with an overriding vision to take it to the next step. So really all we got was that amazing idea that we are being, well, it's not an amazing idea, but the big change idea that we, the majority of the people, control none of the wealth. That's a big change idea. It's not a fun idea. But it didn't get much farther than that, right? And maybe if it would have had leadership, let's hope it would have been benevolent leadership. If it would have had leadership, it might have been able to take steps toward a next step of social change. But we will never know that. Notable exceptions include Occupy Wall Street, the main one in New York City. It became a social movement organization that was actually able to help, still does help people in New York City of lower incomes. It did amazing things to help people. When Hurricane Sandy hit New York City, it was able to help people recover from that. Occupy Atlanta also has, to my understanding, a permanent base, as does Occupy Detroit. There are a number of smaller operations that also call themselves Occupy, the name of the city. There really is a book to be written about the schisming and just the I witnessed in Occupy Columbus. But Occupy Columbus, like many other Occupies, basically failed spectacularly. Anyway, so this movement introduced the idea of income inequality, and what I want to drive home to you is that this is a massive change in what the Germans would call, some others would call, the zeitgeist in our society, right? The common consciousness of the people in the United States. We no longer view the United States as a place where everyone is absolutely has the same opportunities, right? We no longer view the United States as a place where the rich are just the same as us. And that's, it's less optimistic, but it's more realistic. And when you have a realistic vision, you can try to change society toward a better place, right? And, then you can build that new thing. So yeah, I hope this slightly different format of lecture wasn't too jarring for you. If it was, maybe the notes will help a little bit. Let me know if you have any big questions about this stuff. This is how social change happens, and this is the kind of thing I get excited about. And I hope you enjoyed my daughter's tunes, if you could hear that. That was really fun for me. Yeah, let me know if you have any questions, and I will talk to you soon.